of the interesting things that's in talking with other cities about what they're doing is that there are places that are less sort of litigious than New York, where they've been very bold about putting in control systems so that they can dim lights at night or turn them off, particularly in residential neighborhoods where there's less automobile and pedestrian conflict. It's something we talked about in New York. Right now there's not a great receptivity amongst the engineers that I work with. And part of it is the way that lighting, there's not lighting laws, it's not like building code, it's not controlled the same way. It's as you know, as Linnaea knows, and anyone who's designing lighting projects, they're really guidelines. And so until those guidelines begin to change and allow you to, you actually could have 50% less light and people wouldn't notice. But the engineering, the way that you measure the light, you can't actually do it, because if someone trips and falls and sues you, you will lose, because, and it's many, many millions of dollars. So the city is sort of reticent to do that. Other cities have been much braver about doing that, and we're kind of watching that.
Well, you know, there's a profession on this panel and in most discussions about lighting design that's absent, and that is specialists in vision. We have very few, the guidelines for light levels are actually set primarily by the manufacturers of lighting. So when we have people who are vision specialists, where they can say, you need this much amount of, foot candles, which is a measurement of light, on the ground in order to see well, until those people are actually brought into this discussion, it is harder for us to have the correct light levels. But right now, the committee that sets roadway lighting standards, the voting majority are people who sell roadway lighting. And that's why we have, it seems to me, we have a great many, street lights that are brighter than they need to be.
Why is it important that we're talking about the color of lights? Richard, you talked about that in terms of health.
Well, the physiological consequences of light during the night, artificial light during the night, have been very well characterized in people. There are arduous experiments, as I mentioned. 5 medical school students in Philadelphia woken up at the middle of the night, a monochromatic light shined on their retina in a very particular way. It takes years to do this well. Several labs have now replicated this. So we know very well pure light, monochromatic light, what the effect is on the circadian system by virtue of melatonin suppression. And that was the curve that I showed you. It's very clear that that blue that we see at daylight in mid-morning, that pretty blue is actually low wavelength. It's 480, 460, 480 nanometers. And it falls off tremendously. And I mentioned, waking up in the middle of the night is just fine. You can wake up and your circadian system will be fine. You turn on the light and it won't. You suppress melatonin. You have to be in the dark for your circadian system to be okay, but you don't have to be asleep. Sleep-wake is part of the circadian system, of course. So in the middle of the night, the light also, not only does it suppress melatonin and change your body temperature and all that stuff, it's alerting you. It's an alerting response. So again, you can be awake and calm, and then go turn on that bathroom light with the vanity lights, and you're alert, and you're starting to go into daytime physiology. And you don't need that. You can get to sleep a lot better if you have to have a light, turn on a little red one, for safety, of course, in the bathroom, what have you. But that period, it's called quiet wakefulness. That period which we have lost of 1, 2, 3 hours in the middle of the night. So that's like transcendental meditation. And I'm a practitioner now, and I give classes and give certificates on how to do this quiet wakefulness. That's something we have lost.
Thoughts on the color?
The color, I think it's interesting, because I'm sure we sent all of you out into the streets now, that there's many people in this room who would say, what are you talking about, the color? It doesn't have a color. Not everyone, I think, is sensitive to the color and can actually see that. I think if you put 2 different types of light together, most people will be able to see it, but not everyone will. I think some of the subtlety of, Susan showed it in her slide, but sometimes you get into this sort of talking about color temperature, and people's eyes start to glaze over. But I think it's hard to understand. But there is, your average light bulb in your house, if you still have incandescent lamps, tend to be very yellow, and some of the street lights are also very yellow. The newer, the LEDs are whiter and give you a sort of fuller spectrum of, you see colors a little more accurately. And people have different preferences, which is, I think, why some of this gets very subjective. But then there is the science, which is, pretty clear in terms of how our vision works. So there's most people, it seems like around the city, have been asking for white light. They like it when it's whiter. I can't actually explain why. Maybe someone else could comment on that. But that is actually something that people seem to like, and they tend to feel that it's potentially safer, that they can recognize the facial recognition is better under white light.
New York City's going to replace 200,000 streetlights, 250,000 streetlights. Who cares if they're white or a little bluer or whatever? Why does that matter?
Well, this astronomic argument's been the bluer the light, the underlying light, the more you're closing the window of the ability to see into the sky. So they're arguing strenuously for us using, not only for us using monochromatic, low pressure sodium, because the more diverse our light sources are, the less penetrable the sky is. So if you listen to some of the Italian astronomers who've been really researching it, their feeling is the closer we get to white light, the more problematic it's going to be. That's who cares, I think.
I have a question about, say, citizens' right relative to the light coming off public building. Well, I don't know if it's a public building, but for instance, there's a new building, or at least the lighting on it is new. All of a sudden, the top of this building is massively lit, and it is annoying at best. And then sometimes they go from the white blue light, and on a holiday, they'll turn it the color that goes with the holidays, pink on Valentine's Day, and it's, all those things, red, white, and blue on Veterans Day. And it's really intrusive. Is there anything that a citizen?
Well, the problem in New York City right now is we have our New York City Planning Department, before our development is installed, we don't have guidelines or regulations. In other towns that have what we call dark sky regulations, they'll present a lighting plan that shows exactly, the type of fixtures, the hours of operation, and diagrams, so that you'll know ahead of time what the implications would be. So we don't have that in New York. We attempted to have a lighting law passed in the city council, but the representative didn't win his seat back. And we would have then been able to review a lighting plan prior to installation. But there are guidelines for cities.
It is my people also know that under the new lead rulings, which will be coming in 2 years.
Yeah, but those that are voluntary.
They are, but there's a cultural shift toward
Uh-huh.
LEED and to the advantages of LEED. So more and more buildings I'm working on, it's not even a question that we're not meeting LEED. The question is, are we meeting platinum? So I think I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying there's an optimistic, I feel optimistic that this idea of controlling light and of limiting light trespass and of thinking efficiently about the exterior of the buildings is now being incorporated into the general thinking. So it may not happen as a law, but it may happen as people begin to think about LEED as a...
I still think we need to have a law.
You might be right.
I think that well, you're both sort of right. I think legislation, though, has not been terribly effective in terms of managing some of these things, and there's many sides to the story. But I think Linnaea is correct in that some of the design of lighting in new buildings is really looking towards motion sensors so that the lights go out when people are not actively in the spaces. Many of the new buildings, actually, the lights do stay on, which is pretty annoying. But there is
a decorative thing,
right.
Taking the top of the building and making it at the Times Square.
Right, and there is not regulation that controls that. There is zoning that could control it, but there is no sort of central way that the city has jurisdiction. These are private buildings, and they're concerns of, you know, citizens groups could be potentially affected, but right now there is no, we don't regulate them. They're not regulated, but there are energy considerations and there are green building codes that are being rewritten that will hopefully in the future be helpful. But then there's also that aspect of the sort of celebrating the city. So there's this kind of fine line between what's a sort of celebratory gesture, what's a civic gesture, and then what's a very annoying gesture.
We're working in the studio on a proposal for a large city project in Texas where we're developing a portable lighting fixture that we think might be a little bit like the bike share program, where you're able to pick up a light and carry it through this particular corridor and then return it at the end. And one of the reasons, you know, one of the ways we think about it, and maybe this goes back to the point that I was making before, is in order for some of these kind of new strategies to be really even conceivable, let alone effective, is you have to have a kind of cultural shift. People have to buy into this. You have to make the argument, and then you have to sort of figure out how to be democratic about it, which I think is very much a city lighting issue, is you have to treat communities the same. You have to provide this to everyone. You can't. So we don't want to make it expensive. We want anyone to be able to use it, and we want to develop a culture. And sometimes that means that you have to bring people in. You have to get the message out. You have to go talk at universities. You have to say, let's think about this. So that's the context. I don't think of it as technical. I think of it as cultural.
I think it is a cultural shift that has to happen. I mean, it's people, when you talk about lighting with people who are not lighting designers or people who are not scientists or familiar, it's a very difficult topic to talk about because it can get very into the weeds very quickly, and I think people don't, a lot of people, oddly enough, when we're looking at lighting fixtures for the street, look at them during the day. They look at these things and say, gee, I like the way that looks. And it's like, it's a light fixture, you gotta turn it on. And so you have this ridiculous discussion going on about, you know, the sort of filigree on the thing, and that's really not what matters. And then the quality of light, it's most people are not really making sort of subtle enough distinctions about other ways to do this. It's like they want it bright or it's too dark or whatever. So it's real. Some of it's education, I think, and some of it is it's cultural. I think people feel that the issue of safety, which I think mostly everyone's mentioned, people think more light is safer, and in fact, there's no real correlation between that. Although you do need to light pedestrians, so automobiles can, yeah, exactly. So where you have a high pedestrian traffic as you do in New York and lots of automobiles, you have a conflict. So, but I do think, I haven't seen it, but there were some wonderful articles about in Paris, and we talked about doing this in New York, but haven't gotten very far with it. But the notion of master plan, lighting master plans for cities, and there are parts of Paris that I think are doing that, so that you figure out what different districts are, how to light them, and you get agreement that it's actually being done. I don't know exactly how, but they're managing.
But it's also good to keep in mind that Paris has their own, not only do they have their own lighting maintenance department, but they have their own truck and jumpsuits. So their investment is huge.
Maybe that's what we need,
Jumpsuits.
Back to your,
The lady mentioned something I had not thought of, and that is in the category of vandalize and get sued. Is that a real issue? I know we live in a litigious society, but does the city get sued for bad light?
Yes. Well, here's what they get. If someone trips on a sidewalk, this city is it's just legendary, the number of trip and fall cases. So the first thing, if it happens at night, the first thing they do is go out and check and say, what was there light, and did the lighting levels meet the guidelines for whatever that particular roadway is. Now, 9 times out of 10, they do. The light could have been out, and in which case, that's a problem. The city is usually responsible. Usually the lawsuit is settled on some other terms, but that's part of it. And they call it, our lighting engineers in the agency, I won't say they live in fear, because they really aren't afraid of anybody, but they do say, well, if you give me a note for the file saying I don't have to light this, I'll do whatever you want, but I'm responsible for lighting it to a certain level.
So to compensate for liability is just turn the lights up.
Turn them up.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could.
Yeah, limitation of liability, turn the lights up.
But who would have to give them a note?
Well, you would have to say that, that the lighting levels which are established by the Illuminating Engineering Society, and they like to, you know, they have to could go on about RPA and all of those things, they like to a certain level. So we would really like those, I personally would like those levels changed. We think everything's overlit, particularly with LEDs. So if you gave them a note from them that said, you know what, we've reconsidered lighting levels, they really don't need to be that bright, they could light to a different standard. It's not that they believe that there needs to be that much light. So some of it is in the guidelines, as Susan mentioned. I don't think it's just because these are lighting manufacturers that are making these. I think it's just somewhat antiquated, and it takes a long time to change guidelines.
Thank you.